I would tell him, "Come get me, Dad," and he would take me to his house, which was out in the country because I lived in New Orleans,
Mm.
Louisiana. By the way, that's where I'm from. And he lived in Slidell, Louisiana, which was on the outside of New Orleans, which is more of a rural country area.
Mm.
And I would spend summers with him, 3 month summers. But any and everything that he wanted to do, he did as if I wasn't there.
Okay.
He was a drug dealer, as I
Yeah.
said, and so he would do his drug deals. He would take me to his whores houses. He would
Mm.
take me to the bar, like wherever he went. He just took me with him, because he wasn't a dad,
Mm.
and so I was exposed to that side of the fence as well because my dad's from Mississippi. He too himself was dropped out of school in the third grade to work the cotton fields of Mississippi because my great grandparents were sharecroppers in America, after coming out of slavery, and so they worked their land and what have you. And my grandmother, my father's mother, she had 12 kids. Out of the 12, she only had two girls, so she
Mm.
had 10 boys. All of these boys she had, I think two preachers came out of that, but the rest were pimps and hustlers, growing up in the 50s and 60s,
Mm.
and so my dad being one of those, he was a drug dealer. He trained race horses because he was a country boy, so he knew how to work with race horses, and he had a landscaping business. That's how he made his money.
I'm with you. Can you share with us some of your biggest challenges while growing up until now, up until you got the job at Popeyes? Um, can you share with us any like traumatic moments that you feel like in your adult life that held you back?
Yeah, my lack of practical education,
Oh, okay.
has always been my challenge. Like I said, at one time I couldn't read, so I'm a self-educated man, and I became self-educated really basically when I started studying scripture. But because I couldn't read, I used to listen to my Bible tapes with my
Mm,
Walkman. If
I'm
you
with you.
remember Walkmans, I don't know if you're old enough to remember
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Walkman.
Just about.
Yeah, but I had my Walkman and my Bible tapes, and I would just play scripture,
Ah,
scripture, scripture. So the very first book that's ever gone into my subconscious mind is the Bible. And so that is the foundation of my education is scripture. And then I went from, just listening to scripture to looking up words in Greek and looking up words in Hebrew and doing church history. And so I began to self-educate just in researching the Bible. And then the various jobs that I had, whenever I applied for a job, I always said I graduated from high school. And if they hired me, I had to be a quick learner. And so that was one of the skills that I picked up very quickly is to learn what they showed me right away because I couldn't let them know that I didn't know.
mm.
And so I played the part, and then they gave me the job, and then I exceeded at the job more than anyone else because I could not disclose that I was an uneducated person, you see.
Over delivering.
Yes, yes, yes. But when I got into five-star dining, where I literally worked in a full tuxedo, I was always the back waiter, which is basically a busboy.
Okay.
There's the front waiter, or there's the captain, the front waiter, and the back waiter, right? Well, the captain is the lead that goes to the table and he presents the wine and he presents the menu and what have you. And
Mm.
then, the front waiter, he assists him in doing those things. And he has to have some knowledge of that too, in case they ask him questions at the table, he needs to be able to answer. But the back waiter just goes and cleans the tables.
Yeah.
He's still in a tuxedo, but he's basically just a busboy. So I was never able to exceed to the higher positions that required me to study um, things like wine and become a wine connoisseur or recipes because I'm not much of a cook anyway. But I was always challenged with with reading things to retain information. I've
Ah,
never been a page turner ever. I've never finished a book just
really?
reading through a book
Never
ever.
ever still now?
Never ever in my life.
Okay.
For me, I was always a purpose reader. If I'm going into a book, I'm going in to get what's in it that I
And then
need from it.
flee.
Once I got what I want,
Yeah.
I'm done with the book.
Okay.
And so And so I'm not a novel reader or anything like that. I basically research stuff because I was into personal development and human relations and human behavior
Mm.
that I got fascinated with when I went to private security school, to be a private security guy. And they had a course called Human Relations and Human Behavior. Well,
Okay.
I was fascinated about that, because
Yeah.
I was like, how do we work? I wanted to know
Yeah.
everything
Yeah.
about humanity. I'm studying the Bible, now I'm studying this. And so those were the two things that drove my purpose in life, for self-educating myself.
Mm.
To get information. And so as I was gathering information and really being passionate about learning those things is how I started self-educating.
What was the process and the steps leading up to you starting that course?
The private security,
Mm.
I just wanted a job,
Oh,
and
really?
security jobs were available, and anyone can get a security job, and
Yeah,
and
yeah,
I was
yeah,
trying to
yeah.
go into private security,
Yeah.
which pays a little more, for a bodyguard or or personal driver, or stuff like that.
Mm.
And I was trying to get more into that arena of security, and that's why I took that course.
Okay. How old was you then?
I was 19,
Okay.
18,
No, yeah.
19, I was very young. I just started, I gave my life to Christ at 17, and, now I'm listening to stuff. And then I was like, okay, what do I do in my life?
Mm.
And then I was like, okay, well, I can be a security guy. And then I went to private security school. So it was about 18, 19, right
Okay.
after I gave my
How long
life.
was that for?
The course, I think it was a 9-month course to finish it.
Yeah.
I had to pay for that class. It's just a vocational class, that I had to pay for.
Okay. So let's dive into, because you mentioned your addictions.
Mm.
Okay. What part of your life did they start being
Well,
a part of your life?
I would say at 15 is when I smoked my first joint,
Okay.
you know. And again, back in the 80s, I grew up in the 80s, in 83, 84, I was 15, 16 years old, Um, and yeah, so my first joint, was the gateway,
Mm.
obviously,
Yes.
and we used to be, my boys, my friends, we used to be those guys on the corner, drinking cheap wine
Yeah.
and
I was
singing to
there.
the Temptations,
Yeah.
and just beat bopping or whatever on the corner, late at night and just getting high. I was never a drinker though. I was a weakling when it came to alcohol. But we were drinking cheap wine, Thunderbird, Mad
Oh,
Dog 2020, Wild Irish Rose,
yeah.
Boom Farm, all of that cheap wine and that gets you drunk really fast, and I would really get sick as a dog. I couldn't drink. I was weakling when it came to drinking. So thank God, because I probably would have had to get over alcoholism too,
Mm.
if I really was a strong drinker. But
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
But then after that, I was first introduced to crack cocaine when a buddy of mine broke up some crack and he laced it over a joint, which
Mm.
they call a primo, right?
Crack or coke?
Crack.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
crack.
Mm.
Um, First time I snorted coke was with my brother, and I was about 15 years old too. But
Mm.
that didn't make any sense to me. Putting this stuff in my
Oh,
nose
really?
and it draining down my throat, and I didn't like it.
Oh, okay.
It's just it turned me off. But smoking has always been my biggest addiction. Cigarettes, marijuana, and and then taking the crack and breaking it up in powder and putting it over marijuana and rolling that up
Mm.
is how I was introduced to crack.
Okay.
You know,
Go for it. How was your relationship with that?
I never really became addicted to it. It was more of a social
Mm.
party kind of thing. If I wasn't with other people, I never really went after it or
Oh,
chased it.
okay.
It was always in a party setting. Where
Yeah.
I
Recreational.
yes, I would just participate. And then it did get to a point later on. I was hanging out with this girl who liked to smoke a lot, and then I was smoking a lot more on a pipe now.
Mm.
Just hanging out with her, and I got a sense of what it was to yearn for the high.